Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic for you today, a little dark, so let's do it. What's the most effed up thing you've ever seen or did? Some of this is very not safe for work. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I saw my little brother getting hit by a car and flying a few meters through the air when he was only 6 years old. Fortunately, he didn't even break a bone, but damn, I'll never forget this. Found a dead body on the sidewalk in front of my building on my third day living in New York City. When I told my supervisor about it at work, hoping to process it with someone, she just kind of brushed it off like, "Welcome to New York." The most effed up thing I've seen was a guy who had just been in a motorcycle accident bleeding out on the side of the freeway. He was clenching onto the hand of the girl who was the driver of the car involved. She was crying hysterically. I saw his hand turn white in a matter of seconds. I remember it whenever I see someone on a bike. Worked in a gas station in the 80s. Some guy came in after midnight and bought a cigarette lighter. He walked outside and went over to one of the gas pumps and pumped gas all over himself, set himself on fire after that. After I tripped the emergency shutoff for the pumps, me and another customer ran outside. The customer tried to put the fire out on the guy with his jacket, and I used the fire extinguisher on the other things that were on fire. Eventually, we succeeded, but the guy was seriously burned all over. This was the 80s, so most of his clothes were synthetic fabric that had melted into his flesh. His face was kind of melted too. The ambulance came really quick, and he was taken away. He didn't die, but I never saw him again. I talked to some cops a while later, and they said that he was on probation and was protesting about his treatment and tried to commit suicide. Fatal hit-and-run vehicle accident that happened in front of me. A car got struck by someone who ran a red light. The truck at fault basically slowed down a second and then drove away. I stopped to check on the people in the car. It was a couple of teens. The guy having substantial leg injuries, and the girl was unconscious and losing a lot of blood. Like, her pants, seat, and floor carpet were becoming saturated with it. She basically stopped breathing and lost her pulse before the ambulance got there. The guy was crying and begging for me to help her, though there wasn't much I could do. Once she was loaded on the ambulance, the guy started pacing around on his bad leg and basically having a panic attack. The ambulance crew and some firefighters were mostly busy with the girl, so me and one other firefighter were trying to calm the guy down. He finally collapsed in pain, and another ambulance arrived to get him taken care of. I remember getting in my car to drive home, turning the radio off, having a "what the F just happened" moment, then driving home in silence while trying to process it. Didn't get much sleep that night, obviously. I later learned that they never got her pulse back. She was either 15 or 16 years old. Don't exactly remember. There are a few things that boil my blood warmer or make me more angry more quickly than when there's a vehicle accident or a vehicle striking a person and them stopping, assessing, and then leaving without even trying to render aid or taking no responsibility. Horrible. Bye. I witnessed a bad car accident once. The car launched off of an overpass as I went under it. The car flipped several times. It was like something out of a movie. I was the first person on the scene. My wife called 911. It was not a pretty sight. The first thing I remember seeing was a severed arm beside the road. There wasn't much left of the person's body. I worked for a horse training ranch for a month when I was a kid. Me and the dude I worked with found a cow that had been dead for a while out in the field. It was bloated and gonna blow soon. We did not engage with the cow. We weren't prepared for a cleanup that day. When we came back prepared for cleaning the next day, it had ruptured and the smell was life-changing. It was spiritually bad. Since I was basically an unpaid intern, the paid guys told me to take a hike. 14-year-old me took a hike. I was a hard-working kid, and they knew it, so they let me off with that one. My story seems pretty lame after reading some of these stories. I saw a guy get his hand eaten by the Gatling gun on an A-10 aircraft in 1981. He had his arm stuck in the gun for at least 6 hours while medical people were shooting him up with painkillers. They had no clue how to get him out without amputating his hand. They ended up taking the gun out of the aircraft. Understand, this is a big effing gun, like the size of one of those old Volkswagen Bugs. They took the gun apart as much as they could and medevaced him out with this gearbox that had to weigh 200 pounds on his hand. I saw this guy about 6 months later, just before I transferred to another base. He had this giant bandage on his hand and 4 fingers and a thumb sticking out of it. Not sure how well everything worked, but he did have his fingers. Grabbed my son the split second we were hit by a speeding car when he got off of his school bus. Had I not taken all the impact, he'd be dead. He had a TBI from hitting the ground though. He lost adult teeth, he was 10, and road rash. I had to stumble and crawl to him breathless while a bus full of school children were screaming, having witnessed it. He's alive and thriving. This was December 2021. I found my best friend with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. He put a blanket over his head and used trash bags as basically a tarp. His mom called me and was very concerned about how he was talking recently. Nothing suicidal, just different from how he would normally talk with her. He begged her to stay home from school for a couple of days after his mom called me. She told him he has to go, but she leaves for work before he goes to school. So he lied and was saying he was at school. The mom got a call from the apartment next to her asking what Alex is doing walking by the highway. She then called me to ask if he was at school. I said no, he wasn't in first or second hour. She started freaking out and was pleading for someone to go check on him. She works hours away from the apartment. My school was only 15 to 20 minutes away from the apartment. Not once ever did I think he was depressed or suicidal, nor did he ever have a bad day, it seemed like. Always making people laugh and could hold a conversation like no other. I learned that day you never know what demons people are facing. I have a key to the apartment, so I unlock the door and walk in, and I proceeded to say an inside joke as a way to announce myself. I walked right past the living room and went to his room, and he was not in the room. Went downstairs where he hangs out, wasn't down there. Peeked my head around the wall to do a quick check in the living room because that is the last place he ever goes. When I walked past earlier, I thought the plastic trash bags were a sheet. I only caught it out of the corner of my eye walking up the stairs to his room. The amount of blood and brain matter that was on his lap is something I can never get out of my head. As well with the phone call with his mom letting her know. Hearing a mother's loss is the most primal, animalistic scream you will ever hear. I'm sorry that you had to discover that. I'm sorry that you had to make that phone call to their mother. I'm just sorry for everything in that scenario. I hope you're doing a little bit better. Heartbreaking. A girl was trying to kill herself. She broke a window, took a shard, and cut her arms open. Then she locked the door and sat against it so her dead weight would keep it closed as people were trying to break in. The others went looking for help to break the door in, and I sat on the other side of the door talking to her, trying to get her to open it, as her blood seeped out from beneath the door. We got the door open, and she lived. It was the blood coming under the door, knowing she was dying, that was just, I don't know, effing hardcore effed up. The 2 guys welded to a pole. The supply voltage to the overhead wires on the Melbourne, Australia metropolitan train system is 1500 volts DC. God knows how many amps. An F-ton, anyway. DC current grabs and holds. They tried to steal the copper. They failed. The current has grabbed them and boiled them dry. All the visceral fluids were gone. When I was 22 on New Year's Eve, I ended up in the hospital for alcohol poisoning. In the bed next to me was a 16-year-old kid for the same thing. His friends were scared to call for help when he collapsed, so he wasn't transported until hours later when his older brother came home. His blood alcohol content was slightly lower than mine. Mine was 0.382, so I don't really know how I came out okay. But he was brain dead. Listened to his parents discuss organ donation before he was taken off life support. Saw. I was sitting in a cafe in a busy city center one time. A homeless couple were walking down the street. He had a very unstable and aggressive demeanor. She was scantily clad, and every inch visible flesh was covered in bruises. She was walking hand in hand with him, looking terrified, holding a bunch of flowers. I can't know for sure what the context of the situation was, but it looked absolutely heartbreaking. The streets were absolutely packed with people, but these two had a large empty bubble of space around them as they went. Watched my sister get impaled and killed by a tree. Context: we lived at the bottom of a huge hill. The back walls of our house were touching the ground, basically. One day we were playing in the laundry room when we heard a weird snap, and seconds later a huge oak tree came crashing down through the roof, and one of the branches went through her back. She was screaming, but only for like 4 seconds. It was like the air just got sucked out of her. Neighbors came running over, and all I remember after that is getting scooped up by the neighbor and then walking up in the hospital. It's been 17 years. Through therapy and time, it's more than okay to speak about it. Life goes on, and so must we all. I was the captain of a snowboard team, and we were practicing backflips. An 18-year-old skier rode up and asked whether he could practice with us. He landed on his head. I was first to him and asked him whether he could feel his legs. He said yeah. In the time between then and when ski patrol showed up with a sled, he had lost feeling in his legs. Seeing someone that young realize that they were paralyzed was heartbreaking. He quickly went into shock. Where I lived when I was a kid, there was a big park just off the center of the town that an F-ton of homes backed up to. In the middle was a big hill with a massive pond on one side and a big kids' jungle gym to the side of the hill and pond. This pond would freeze over every winter, so it wasn't that deep, but still too deep and dark for anyone under the age of 12 to be in safely. The town that surrounded this little park was also not that big, maybe 15,000 people at the time, and it was a hotspot for kids. So it was not weird to see me and my sister playing at that park after dinner with the 20-some other neighborhood kids. What was weird was to see 2 grown men come to the pond with a 420-liter plastic bucket, walk up to the pond, open the plastic buckets, and dump them into the pond. What was in the buckets? Puppies. Less than 2-week-old puppies, right in front of the 20-some kids that were sitting on the side of the hill facing the pond. The men didn't even see us until one of the girls that had processed what was happening in front of our eyes screamed. And I mean bloody murder scream. It made the men jump and just throw the other buckets into the pond and run. 10-year-old me, completely ignoring all the warnings of my parents to never go into the pond, did the only thing I could. I jumped into the pond to save as many of these little lives as I could. 6 others joined me, and of smaller ages. The 2 unopened buckets sunk so fast to the floor of the pond, and it took 3 of us to drag them up, while the others frantically grabbed for loose puppies. I was trying to rip open one of the lids when my sister and 4 other kids ran to our homes to get our parents for help, came back with my dad and several other parents. My dad and one other pair had grown up on the ranches, so they quickly got to work reviving the pups that we couldn't get to fast enough. Vets from around the farming community showed up minutes later as well after being contacted by parents. The eldest kids, 14 to 15-year-old, sprinted after these men who jumped into a small pickup on the only road that ran along the park's far side. We're now giving statements to the police who were in a rush to get these guys. The rest of the kids that just weren't able to process what had just happened started crying then as well. My dad told me that the puppies were cold, so please hold them to warm them up. Crazy me then ran to these crying kids and said, "No time to cry, hug a puppy," and started handing out puppies, totally ignoring that I might have just caused some trauma to those poor kids. But it worked. Out of the 52 puppies that were dumped, 36 were saved. The 16 pups that couldn't be saved were never going to make it, either from crush syndrome, starvation, or blunt trauma. Our quick actions ensured the survival of all the pups that could have been saved in the first place. However, this is not the worst part of the story. As I told my dad and the cops something that I hadn't really understood at the time, when I had dived to get the buckets before all the slit got kicked up, I had mentioned seeing bones at the bottom of the pond. I didn't understand how big that was till the park was closed off and the pond drained. There were thousands of puppy and dog bones. The men were part of a puppy mill that ran just outside of town and had been dumping the bodies of unsold and undesirable pups and non-breedable dogs there for years. But they had never been caught before, as they would always wait till night and would make sure the dogs were dead and attach rocks to them to keep bodies from floating. The men that had caused the entire downfall had been newly hired to the pup mill and had thought that all the extra work was not needed. The pond was filled in, and a memorial to dogs now sits where the pond once sat. The park was then fenced and made into a dog park. TLDR. Local puppy mill dumped thousands of puppy and dog bodies for years into the town park pond. Were found out when 20-some kids watched two new guys to the mill dump live pups into the pond and save who we could. The park is now a memorial dog park. Well, hopefully the community took care of the people responsible for doing that atrocity or committing that atrocity, either through the punitive or civil system, or they just take care of it themselves, if you know what I mean.